Thank you to the intrepid few of you who have braved our difficult times to be present today. And welcome to the last, or the second to last lecture of the course. In many ways, this lecture and the one next week are conclusions to the story we've told over the course of the last, 13, 14, 15, 16 weeks. And these two last lectures take off really where we left off in our lecture and discussion last week with the crisis of modernity, and the crisis of modernity that expressed itself in at least two ways I've suggested to you. A return to orthodoxy. In some ways that's the theme of today's lecture, with Orthodox Russia, but with a question mark. Is the crisis of modernity met, in Russia at least, with a return to tradition, to traditional values? Is it a going back to the past? Or to what extent is it? In some ways it is. There's also another element that we will take into account in today's lecture, and that is a vision of Russia as part of a larger whole, not merely as a nation or a nation state. Perhaps Russia has never really been a traditional nation state, but part of a larger Neo-Eurasian community. You might remember that Eurasianism was a kind of philosophy developed in the 1920s by several émigré Russian philosophers, like the Count Nikolai Trubetskoy, whose writings on chauvinism and cosmopolitanism we've read. And for Trubetskoy, the vision of Russia he wanted to offer, having just left the Bolshevik, you could say, revolution, or having in some sense escaped to Europe, was that Russia's identity should be sought in concert with, in harmony with the East. That the Mongol invasions, which had for so long been seen as part of an, you could say, part of an antagonistic element in Russian history, should actually be incorporated. That Russia's place was really in Eurasia. So these are the two, you could say, big questions, philosophical, intellectual history questions we'll be dealing with today in connection to Russia and in connection to Eastern Europe more generally. But the crisis of modernity is where we left off, and it's at, you could say, at the root of both this lecture today and the lecture next week. So the large question is Russia's response and Eastern Europe's response, in some ways, a return to the past, a pursuit of more authentic and indigenous value than has been achieved over the course of this long Faustian attempt to create a new world order, of which you could say the Soviet Union was perhaps the most dramatic example, at least in Russia and in Eastern Europe. But we're also left with a question about what is the crisis of modernity? Is it first and foremost a moral crisis, or is it an economic crisis? Maybe there are other ways of thinking about it too. Is it a crisis about justice and doing the right thing, or is it a crisis about political economy and production and failure, you could say, of a state and of a society to provide its society with its needs? Is it, in other words, to use our language, a crisis of development, or is it a crisis of democracy? Democracy, of course, being kind of the crisis, the moral crisis, and economics, in some ways, being the developmental crisis. That's another question I'd ask you to consider as we move more deeply into today's lecture. Today's lecture has a lot of slides and actually a lot of film clips in it too. An opportunity to think about how various groups, peoples, nations have tried to tell the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union and what came thereafter. So I want to begin in part one with a look at the disintegration of the multi-ethnic Soviet Union, the multi-ethnic Soviet periphery in particular, before turning our gaze more specifically to the crisis of Soviet modernity and its putative return to orthodoxy, and perhaps its move on to Eurasianism. Perhaps the person who embodies the moral question or the moral problem of the Soviet Union best at the end was the artist, singer we just saw, whose music we just listened to at the very beginning, Viktor Tsoi and his rock group Kino. In this video, which I wanted to call attention to one of the great late Soviet, you could say, developmental problems, the problem of the Soviet environment. If you notice in this video, we see a kind of windswept, snow-encrusted steppe, it looks like, and in the distance, what is that? A ship. And why is there a ship? What is a ship doing in the middle of a steppe and a desert? Well, this was the great Soviet, you could say, environmental crisis. The Soviet Union had managed to drain the Aral Sea. All of this used to be an ocean, or a sea, rather. And over the course of its use through its application of various water technologies, it had essentially turned that sea into a desert. One might say that the only country in the world up until that point that had done a worse job dealing with the environment than the United States was perhaps the Soviet Union. And those two superpowers were rather horrible in their exploitation of resources. One under the ideology of capitalism, the other under the ideology of socialism. So the choice is not really between the two. In some ways, it's an indictment of modernity itself. But the singer Kino is a great example of, maybe you could say, of a Soviet person, a person who was born of an inter-ethnic marriage to a Korean, to a Korean father and a Russian mother, and as perhaps the most popular celebrity and superstar of the last few years of the Soviet Union, who died very young. I believe he was the victim of a tragic car accident in Riga, in Latvia. But he remained, you could say, as a young martyr, the kind of James Dean of the Soviet Union, forever young, a symbol of a kind of authenticity that the Soviet Union had never managed to achieve. Komsomolskaya Pravda wrote in 1990, "Tsoi means more to the young people of our nation than any politician, celebrity, or writer. This is because Tsoi never lied and never sold out. He was and remains himself. It's impossible not to believe him. Tsoi is the only rocker who has no difference between his image and his real life. He lived the way he sang. Tsoi is the last hero of rock." Perhaps a little hyperbolic, overblown, but it expresses, I think, the hunger at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union for something that had been missing for so long. A sense of authenticity, a sense that people mean what they say and say what they mean. That a kind of a hope, perhaps, to move beyond the moral rottenness and perhaps the economic rottenness of what had been accumulated over the previous few decades. We see this, you could say, desire to return to our true selves, to be who we truly are, most prominently in the disintegration of the multi-ethnic Soviet periphery of the Union, where everywhere the watchwords are national sovereignty and democracy. We were denied by the Soviet Union democracy, we were denied our national sovereignty, and this is now the value, this is the authenticity that we will return to. We'll look a little bit later at the exact way in which the Soviet Union started to crumble at the center and from within, culminating in that Soviet coup to overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev and in Boris Yeltsin's presidency. But first, let's look at the peripheries. In the East and Central Asia, we find Soviet republics turning into sovereign stands. The Kyrgyz SSR, Kyrgyzstan, right? Tajik SSR, Tajikistan. Turkmen SSR turns into Turkmenistan. Uzbekistan emerges too. In the East, where the Soviet Union had played an enormous role in building and creating the nations and national republics and national identities, perhaps the continuity with the past was most prominent, and nowhere more so than in the Kazakh SSR or Kazakhstan, where a president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, reigned really up until last year, as far as I know. Maybe I don't know if how much he's still in the picture right now. Ruling over a 70% Muslim country, 20% Christian country, a former high-ranking official of the Communist Party. Here we can see the kind of transition from the Soviet Union to a new, you can say, nationally sovereign world, but nonetheless still very much shaped by, influenced by, created by the Soviet Union most strongly. In the West, both in the Baltic North and the Caucasian South, we see something a little bit different. And I just want to cast a brief glance to our part of the world, of course, Lithuania and Estonia, before looking at Abkhazia and Chechnya. This is a view, in some ways, informed by our place and time here in Tartu. And one could tell the story using all kinds of different examples as well. But I think there's maybe a value in making use of where you happen to be. Let's look first at the revolution in basketball, or the way that Lithuanians sometimes tell the story of their independence from the Soviet Union. It could be noted here, these next few slides will be kind of fun and amusing, I hope at least, that the four of the starting players on the Soviet team, Šarūnas Marčiulionis, Rimas Kurtinaitis, Arvydas Sabonis, and Valdemaras Džomikias, were Lithuanian. That in ways, the Soviet sport of basketball was largely a Lithuanian sport. There was one prominent Estonian on the team too. And the Latvian, I believe, so the Baltic contingent was very well represented, and one very important Russian as well. But in the last, you could say, Olympic contest between the Soviet Union and the United States, as superpowers in the Olympics was it 1988, the Soviet Union trounced the United States, which is, of course, what the US did what it always does when it gets trounced. It changed the rules of the game. It allowed professionals to play thereafter. But you can see a few minutes from, well, I won't play you that much, but from this last sort of encounter between the Soviet Union and the United States, with the Soviet Union kind of dominating the US. Sabonis passes to Marčiulionis, and that's how they get their points. Now, in any case, when Lithuania gets its independence, they create their own team. Two of these players become the first two players to play in the NBA in the United States. And we see, not too long ago, an interesting kind of retrospective documentary film on this, The Other Dream Team.
The 1992 opening ceremony of Barcelona is one of the cosmic turning points of the 20th century. If you were one of those rare Americans put off by the whole dream team ethic, then it was an easy choice who you were going to root for.
All of a sudden, Lithuania is sitting there with their independence, a nation that's completely bankrupt. One of the local beat writers over the Bay Area wrote a little story that was read by the Grateful Dead.
The Grateful Dead were big basketball fans.
Jerry's like, we're all about freedom and celebration. Basically, we want to help you guys. They cut us a big check and sent a box of tie-dye t-shirts with Lithuanian colors. So that's the way we entered the Olympics.
To finally be free and to be able to see your own flag raised at moments of triumph.
The final game against Russia, live or die.
The whole nation was watching. You have to destroy them. At any cost, you have to win.
It was national pride, something what we dreamed.
You're involved with something that's bigger than just sports, bigger than just rock and roll.
Freedom. Let's go.
In Lithuania, it was a different kind of dream. It was the dream of a nation.
So we're not going to spend too much time on any of these clips, and the point is not necessarily to get swept up in the emotion of it, but kind of to notice the way this story is being told and the common elements in this discourse, how this idea of the collapse of what we can learn about the collapse of the Soviet Union from these popular films that emerge in the aftermath, how they connect to the big themes I alerted you to in the very first few minutes of this lecture. And I'll remind you, right? This idea, is the crisis of modernity a moral crisis or is it an economic crisis? This is an argument for the moral crisis, saying that what matters is not how well you're doing economically, but it's a question of the right to democracy, the right to free speech, the right to your own point of view. A very different topic, very similar theme, is the Estonian sort of revolution in song, or at least as it's been represented as the singing revolution. The great arch was actually kind of a Soviet construction in the 1950s that became the site of the great song festivals in Estonia, and there were song festivals in Lithuania and Latvia too, of course. It's interesting, of course, that the song festival and the singing revolution is told as a single national story. It's not told as the story of three different nations, but rather just the Estonian nation. Another clip from the trailer here too. which was then connected to, really, you could say, the revival as a Lithuanian story of national consciousness, idea of authenticity, returning to your true self, dealing with the moral compromises of the past, culminating on August 23rd, 1989, right, the anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Baltic Way, the holdings of hands across the 3 Baltic states, an expression of solidarity and the hope of a new world order.
The Soviet Union.
Whenever you give free speech to people, then things get out of hand.
This singing together, this was our power.
If 20,000 people start to sing one song, then you just cannot shut them up. It's impossible.
What role can singing play when a nation is faced with annihilation by its neighbors? Can culture hold a people together? The small country of Estonia has faced these questions.
I think that to have freedom through singing was the most important thing maybe in my life.
This is the story of how culture saved a nation.
So we've had a revolution in basketball, a revolution in song, but the disintegration of the Soviet Union happened maybe first and foremost in the Baltic, but it spread everywhere. And it was not everywhere, you could say, an equally peaceful event. I mean, there were casualties in Lithuania, and Latvia and Estonia had perhaps the fewest. But in other parts, turning to the Caucasus, the breakup of the Soviet Union was a much more difficult and to some extent bloody affair. Now, again, this is informed by our position right now in Tartu and in Estonia, and in kind of the way in which the Soviet Union had created, through its friendship of the peoples, relationships among the different national republics within the Soviet Union. And recently, a few years ago, came out a wonderful film, Tangerines, had an Academy Award nominee on an Estonian-Georgian collaboration. It's a product of the friendship of the peoples, or its lingering product, about this, you could say, or inspired by the original war in Abkhazia, 1992 to 93, at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. This is the time that you can see that province becomes, or is attached firmly to Georgia. Now it's been reclaimed by Russia in the 2008 war. But we see the lingering effect or problems of these encounters and confrontations in the decades that followed. So in some ways, the story of Lithuania is a return to your Lithuanian national self, a Catholic self. The story of Estonia is perhaps a return to a secular, nominally Lutheran self. Here we have a question in the Caucasus about what these different territories and provinces are. Are they Orthodox? Are they Muslim? And here I want to play for you also a clip, but this is informed by, again, our perspective here insofar as throughout Soviet history, there was one, and going back to the Russian Empire, there was a village, actually a few villages, that contained an extraordinary number of Estonian emigres. Estonka even was one of those villages in Abkhazia, an Estonian village there, from which I think people were finally only expatriated back to Estonia in the 1990s. But this film really takes place in this village, and such it's completely legitimate to have Estonian speakers there. And it puts this village kind of at the center of the Abkhazian conflict between Orthodox Georgia and Muslim Chechnya in some sense, which was at its root here.
Korjame, palju korjame. Mina olen juba sabiraitel.
kuule, ma teen täna 10 kasti, siis on kokku 200, mis sa arvad, kas aitab?
See sõitis ees, aga see pani tal järel, andis tuld.
Tšetšeen saab nädalaga terveks. Aga grusiin, ma ei tea, kõik sõltub organismist.
Ну что, враги? Его зовут Ахмед. Он Мика.
Знаешь что, грузин? Хочешь жить, не выходи из дома.
Kas sa ei karda, et nad üksteise maha löövad?
Tšetšeen andis ausõna.
Aga grusiin?
Tema ka.
Где мое оружие?
Мандарин не kõrvutan mina Eesti.
Ну давай убей меня, как обещал.
За смерть.
Его, почему ты не уехал в Эстонию?
Seda jamata. Sa tead väga hästi, miks ma siia ei jäänud.
So one thing we can get out of this, at least this last clip, maybe that we didn't get out of the previous ones, the question of the problem of what is the authentic people of the land is very problematic in some places. It's maybe easier to resolve in a place like Lithuania and Estonia that has had national independence before and claims to be returning to national independence of the interwar period. But in parts of the world that never had a clear state identity before, like Abkhazia, like you can say even the Caucasian republics, which were always in a complicated relationship with the Russian Empire. Georgia had in fact been very briefly an independent social democratic state, but for barely a month or two before it was incorporated into the Soviet Union. So the question of what going back to national sovereignty would actually mean is very problematic in these parts of the world. And that's, you could say, this conflict in Abkhazia is just a good example of a symptom of that difficulty. Now, no place, perhaps, is more tragic in the breakup of the Soviet Union than Chechnya, or than the capital of Chechnya, Grozny. Grozny was founded in 1818 on the Suzhna River as an outpost of Russian, you can say, the Russian Empire. So the relationship between Russian imperialism and Chechnya goes back a long way. Grozny was in many ways built in, like most imperial capitals, in a combination of, using a combination of labor and force that came from both Russia and that came from the region itself. These are some postcards from around the turn of these images come from the turn of the century, or not the turn of the century. You have Lenin here, but you have, but from show buildings that were built sort of long before the arrival of Soviet power. Perhaps the most tragic figure in this story, whatever you happen to think about him, is the first. Actually, he isn't the last, but the first president of the Chechen Republic, Ichkeria, Zhokhar Dudayev. And with Dudayev, we also have a local connection. A connection which I would say, again, traced to the friendship of the peoples and to Tartu. Because Dudayev, before he became the president of Chechnya, lived in this town where we are right now and worked right around the corner as the head of the Soviet Air Force in not only in Tartu, but in all of Estonia, and commanded, you could say, the largest fleet of nuclear bombers who were based here in the city as well, in the concealed Radi airfield. You can go visit it today. It's where the National Museum is now. But Dudayev is, in some sense, you could say, the most powerful man in Soviet Estonia from 1986 to the time of the breakup. And his story, you could say, is typical of the tragedy of the Soviet experience. In many ways, you could tell his story as a story of upward mobility, a story of benefit, of acquiring a greater voice, more democracy, acquiring a greater sense of self, more development. He was born, but it was also a story of incredible repression, and it seems he carried this with him throughout his entire life, which is why he played the role he did at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union. He was born in 1944, I believe just one day before the deportation, some call it a genocide, of the entire Chechen-Ingush nation under Stalin's rule. This is a time when lots of people were also killed, herded into barns and set on fire, and not a single Chechen was left in Chechnya in this period. He grew up then, and these 500,000 people were deported to the Kazakh SSR and Kyrgyz SSR, and it wasn't until 1957 that they were permitted or allowed to return. At which point Dudayev starts to make his way, you can say, as a young man, into a position of influence. But most doors are closed to Chechens. Most doors of upward mobility, the only way, at least this is the story that many people tell about the Caucasus, the only way for the Caucasians, and especially for the Chechens, to achieve a position of influence and importance is through the military. Higher educational institutions are not really open to them. And Dudayev, you could say, moves up through the ranks by becoming a Soviet Air Force pilot. Then he moves up through the ranks by his marriage to the Russian daughter of one of his commanders, Alla Kulikova, who's an artist, poet, has his connection somehow to Russian culture. He joins the Communist Party in 1968, another, you could say, step on his story of upward mobility, becoming a more influential and important person. In fact, he becomes the general of the Soviet army and the Estonian SSR, the most prominent, the most powerful Chechen perhaps in history. One could look at his story and tell his story as the story of how the Soviet Union enabled the poor and downtrodden and oppressed to become influential and important and powerful. And I think that's a legitimate way to tell the story, but it has to be balanced against the other story, which is how it also deprives people of something in their identity, something in the way they see the world, something in how they want to and need to understand themselves. And I think these stories are most interesting told together. Usually we only tell one. When we tell the story, if you look at the films on Lithuania and the Singing Revolution, that's only about the liberation. Then we can also tell the other story about how it's all about the production of a new man, a new society, and tell that in an optimistic, almost Stalinist key. But what's most interesting, I think, is the tension between those two, and those emerge in the story of General Johar Dudayev. One thing that happened here in Tartu is he made friends. And consider this as perhaps a future research project, to look more precisely at the network of friendships that Dudayev sort of developed here. The most important and prominent was with the Estonian Buddhologist Linnart Mäll. Now, in interviews, Alla Dudayeva has recounted the friendship between Mäll and Dudayev as formative, because Mäll became a member of, and actually the founding president of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization at The Hague. An organization that's now part of the UN, but was originally kind of a dissident group to the UN, trying to represent nations that had not gotten representation yet. Mäll, in creating this organization, or helping to create it, and becoming its president, was having not weekly dinner table conversations in Tartu, in Annelin, and around here with Johar Dudayev, and told him, why don't you join our organization? Why don't you become part of this Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization? The first members of that organization were Armenia, Georgia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. It still exists today, and you might look it up online if you want to see what it's been doing since its inception, and how it's been folded in or incorporated into more, you can say, mainstream political international institutions. But the very notion that Chechnya could be a country, that it could be a nation state, and that Dudayev could be its president, in some ways was cultivated in this very town that we're sitting in right now. And not by chance that some of the first and most important, you can say, footage or coverage of Dudayev's perspective on the world, not Yeltsin's or the Russia's perspective, was produced by Estonians. Here is an interview in 1995, the year before his assassination, because ultimately it's guided missiles sent by Boris Yeltsin that killed Dudayev in 1996. But where he talks about his worldview and his aspirations, and you can see his vision of a more authentic Chechnya, his aspiration for democracy above all things, and also you can say the seething rage and anger that pervades his being.
Господин президент Чеченской Республики Ичкерия, можно вам со стороны эстонской киногруппы Exit Film задавать несколько вопросов? Стоят ли эти огромные жертвы и разрушения желанию чеченцев жить в свободном, независимом государстве?
Свобода и независимость — это для нас жизнь или смерть. Потому что можно было бы жить с народом, в народе, с соседом, в государстве, где защищены какие-то твои права. Где государство или народу перед тобой выполняет обязанности. Их нет. Россия не выполняет никаких обязательств перед народами, перед государством. Поэтому нам просто предлагают в лесу выловленного дикого медведя посадили в клетку и говорят: иди, заходи в клетку и живи с ним, дружи. Подай ему лапу с этим зверем и живи дружно. Вот что такое Россия.
Государственный порядок подходит чеченцам. Парламентская или президентская система?
Прежде всего демократия. При отсутствии демократии никакая власть чеченцев не продержится. Вот там, где есть основа демократии, а потом уже закон действует, а не сперва закон, а потом приобщать его к демократии. Вот для чеченцев это пример. Поэтому парламентская ли власть, президентская власть. Ведь мы прошли земной ад. Разрушение, разрушение, разрушение. Значит, отпуск невероятных средств. Только одним росчерком пера Ельцин подписал 150 миллиардов рублей и 500 миллионов долларов для свержения власти Дудаева. Только на одном документе. И вот эта вся сила, вся эта мощь, 4 года готовились. 4-летняя подготовка генерального штаба, спецслужб. Посмотрите документы. Какую подготовили программу полного уничтожения нации, депортации всего народа, оставить здесь для развода гибриды, чтобы называться, что они уничтожены. Готовили при всех издержках России, экономических, политических, неустроенности, целые городки в регионах, куда должны были пересечь, 4 года строили специальные барачные городки для резервации чеченского народа. Саратовская, Оренбургская, Волгоградская. Даже 1,5-2 года назад чеченская диапрось, находящие там, предлагали: идите, вон вам подготовлены, живите, работайте туда и уходите с этих мест. Беда моя была в том, что я знал об этих планах.
Enough on this. So, in the First Chechen War, you could say the Chechens won. At least they created their this First Chechen Republic, Ichkeria, under Johar Dudayev. On April 21st, 1996, he was assassinated by a guided missile. He'd been given an early cell phone, you could say, and then the cell phone had tracking devices in it. It seems like that's how his location was known. And with the disappearance of Dudayev, you could say a power vacuum also came to Chechnya, and the Second Chechen War is what really lies behind, you could say, the rise to power of Putin and the Putin presidency in Russia. The story of Grozny, of course, I said, is the most tragic story here. You can see the kind of destruction. This is what the hell on earth he was talking about. Rarely has there been a city, well, in World War II bombings, you could say, also showed sites like this. But since the Second World War, a kind of a destruction of a European-style capital on this level has rarely been seen. The 1989 census for the Republic was 400, rather for this city was 400,000. 2002, only half that. Speaks to the way in which it had fallen on difficult times. Now, Grozny and Chechnya were largely, you could say, were part, though, of a kind of a vision of development and maybe managed democracy on the part of the Russian state. Akhmat Kadyrov, the chief mufti of the Chechen Republic, Ichkeria since 1991, turned out to be something of, or he was used as in 1999 as a traitor who really turned, you could say, and Russia exploited, as empires everywhere do, or as states everywhere do, actually. This is not something unique to Russia. Exploited you could say, the differences among the Chechens in the power vacuum left by the departure of Dudayev, different forces, different contingents, the United States has done this plenty in the world as well. And it was through Kadyrov's son, the son of Akhmat, Razman Kadyrov, that somehow Russia and Putin acquired his foothold on power in Chechnya. Here we have a picture of the son below, who declared in 2011 that human rights groups are enemies of the people, among other things, and did part of the Russian-Chechen collaboration is in 2008 the opening of Europe's largest mosque, trying to turn in some ways Chechnya and Grozny itself into a symbol of what can be done with the help of Russian development. In 2016, Akhmat Kadyrov's tower was opened, and Grozny became, in some sense, the Dubai of the Caucasus. There's the tower. Very symbolic. And Grozny is interesting to us in a larger sense, in a more recent sense too, because you could say Grozny is Russia's model for rebuilding Aleppo and Syria. In many ways, what has been done by Russia around the Middle East was tried and practiced and modeled in Chechnya and in Grozny in particular first. So we'll leave Chechnya now, but not before showing you one more great image of what it looks like now, or what it's kind of imagined as now. The Central Soviet era street, Victory Street, has become, of course, Putin Prospect. Might remind us a little bit of Varlam Street at the end of Repentance, where the church has been removed, and we're asked, what good is a road that doesn't lead to a church? And we're told, well, it's now Varlam Street. Well, here is Putin Prospect, but this does lead to a mosque, or a mosque is next to it. In many ways, you can see in this image, if we do a close reading of this image in light of the larger themes of this course, the moral question is answered by the mosque. Yes, we have a new source of religious authority. The developmental economic questions, well, it's answered by the shopping malls and those skyscrapers in the back. That's our development. And we see all the cars on the streets, a clean urban center. Who wouldn't want this vision of very European-style modernity? But with that, having sort of introduced you to some of the dilemmas, the problems, the questions, and you can say the hopes of the disintegration of the multi-ethnic Soviet periphery, I want to turn now to the crisis at the center, the crisis in Moscow, the crisis, you could say, that was at the root of the Soviet collapse. Because none of this would have happened if the center had remained strong. I invited you to think at the beginning of this lecture, too, in terms of both the moral and the economic, in terms of the democratic and the developmental, and asking what the crisis of modernity is all about. And we might ask this about Russia and the Soviet Union itself. Is the return to orthodoxy, to the Orthodox Church, the turn away from atheism, the officially declared Soviet atheism, back to the Church, part of an attempt to make moral amends, to resuscitate or bring back the old imperial era, 19th century moral order? Part of what you say provoked these questions was the Soviet dissident movement that really emerged in the 1960s and culminated in the 1980s, but for which a key moment were the 1975 Helsinki Accords. I'll take a moment here just to remind you that the big myth of the last part of this course is the myth of international solidarity, the international global solidarity. And the Helsinki Accords are a good symbol of that attempt. A negotiation between the capitalist world, the socialist world, 35 different countries, I believe, signed on to nuclear disarmament. Détente was sort of the order of the day, trying to reduce the tensions between the East and the West, but trying to create a kind of international community that was more friendly to all the interests of both the Soviets and the Americans and the Europeans in between. to achieve security and cooperation in Europe, and to respect the rights of those people who had been forgotten by or persecuted by their own governments. If you remember, this was one of the big lessons I said people learned from World War II, was that an international community has to take care of or look at the sufferings of people at the hands of their own government. Because that's what the Holocaust was all about. And the Holocaust and the whole question of human rights arises out of a realization that states are not adequate to protect their own citizens, that states can turn against their own citizens. The question of the dissidents in the Soviet Union is the next, you could say, one following, you say, large example of this problem and this question. So human rights, you say, is one of those larger moral questions in the crisis of modernity that comes to Russia in the 1960s and 70s. At the same time, there are questions about the Russian national identity and the Orthodox Church. It's three different ways, you can say, in which the question of the moral or a question of justice plays out in the last few decades of the Soviet Union. Nobody embodies this problem better than Anatoly Marchenko. He lived a very short life. He died at the age of 48. Had been a apolitical oil driller in the Karganda province in his youth, or rather in his as a young man, and got involved trying to break up a fight among different workers in on his rig or in this, and was put in prison and became thereafter, you could say, a human rights advocate. He actually spent more than half of his life in prison, and his example and his vocal, you can say, statements were an important brought to the attention of the West that the Gulag had not ended with Stalin, that there still was a very significant Soviet camp system. And there were people like Anatoly Marchenko who were being imprisoned. He was imprisoned under Khrushchev, right? This is not under Stalin. And he spent more than half his life there. His letter on Czechoslovakia in 1968 predicting the Soviet invasion got him sent back to that prison for a significant amount of time. In 1976, coming out of the Helsinki Accords, he became the co-founder of the Moscow-Helsinki group, trying to use, you say, this moment of détente, this moment of international cooperation, to call attention to the problems of Soviet dissidents as the great human rights failure of the Soviet Union. The failure of the Soviet Union to protect people against their own government and the kind of persecution of those who would say anything different. In 1988, posthumously, 2 years after his death, he became the first recipient of the Sakharov Prize for Human Rights, together with a very famous co-holder of that grant, I think anybody, Nelson Mandela. But perhaps the two figures through which this problem of a return to orthodoxy can be best brought to life, the two Soviet dissidents, maybe much more famous than Anatoly Marchenko himself, are Andrei Sakharov, for whom the prize is named that Marchenko got in 1988, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn as well. Andrei Sakharov, the great Soviet nuclear physicist, who became a dissident, was put under house arrest for questioning the use of all of these technologies he had helped to develop for purely destructive purposes. But he preached a kind of dissidence and a morality that was in an internationalist key. His claim, his vision, was one for the human community as such, as a whole, not for any particular national community. And it's important to remember that Soviet dissidence happens in at least two keys, of which Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn are the best two examples. Sakharov in an internationalist key, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn in a nationalist key. In many ways, Solzhenitsyn is an even more famous dissident than Sakharov was, for his book, sometimes called the most important book of the 20th century, by, again, perhaps an exaggeration, but not maybe by much, because there are very few books that have had more influence than the Gulag Archipelago had. The book that circulated in Samizdat at first was written in part too here in Estonia, partly here in Tartu as well. In his memoirs, Solzhenitsyn claims that it was in Tartu that he first found the place that he could actually have the quiet and calm to collect his thoughts and was not always looking over his shoulder to see if the KGB was there. he actually did most of his writing not in Tartu itself, but in the Estonian countryside. And so there was, again, an interesting way in which our small town and republic here has played a role in facilitating major events in world history. But the Gulag Archipelago, which sort of illustrated or drew a picture of the Soviet Union as a constellation of camps. I suggested this to you. I evoked this for you in my Hitler-Stalin lecture a little bit. But in many ways, I owe that image to Solzhenitsyn. Because Solzhenitsyn was the first to call the Soviet Union that, a Gulag Archipelago. What is an archipelago? An archipelago is a constellation of islands. And he said the whole Soviet Union could be imagined as a constellation of islands, these islands of camps. And that if we want to understand how the Soviet Union works, how it brings development and so-called democracy to people, we can't look beyond the camp system. It depends on the system. Without this kind of slave labor, the great vision of Soviet modernity would not be possible. Alexander Solzhenitsyn had a great kind of affinity, too, a famous affinity for Estonians. He was also kind of famous for being skeptical about Jews and perhaps being anti-Semitic as well. And it turned out toward in the 1990s and into the 2000s, he became a great fan of Putin too, and Putin's Russia as a way of restoring a national pride to Russia and a national vision to the Russian people. We've lingered long enough on the slide, and I hope you've gotten out of it the main idea or main point, was that the crisis of Soviet modernity invited a return to orthodoxy. But it left Russia with a question of what that orthodoxy should be. And it provided at least two possible answers. An internationalist human rights vision of that orthodoxy, represented by Andrei Sakharov, and a kind of more nationalist or more limited vision, Slavophile vision, going back to Dostoevsky, going back, you could see, trace a kind of a line through several of our thinkers in this course, culminating in Solzhenitsyn. The immediate answer to the problem of orthodoxy in the 1986 was, let's go back to Leninism. Orthodoxy was Orthodox Leninism. And that's what Mikhail Gorbachev promised when he came to power as the last general secretary of the Soviet Union in 1985. On a level of economic development, there was widely acknowledged in the Communist Party, at least, a sense that the Soviet Union was not working. There was economic stagnation. There was environmental pollution. Public health problems were all around. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 was just you could say, the icing on the cake. There was the military failure in Afghanistan. On all levels, it seemed that what the Soviet Union was doing abroad, what it was doing at home, wasn't working. Though nobody predicted the collapse, and that has to be also emphasized. And perhaps we'd be telling a slightly different story if Gorbachev had followed the Chinese route, path more. But Gorbachev, unlike the Chinese at this moment at least, believed in powerful democratic reforms to change, or wanted to bring more, again, in the Leninist spirit, a kind of new spirit to the Soviet Union. Not to destroy the Soviet Union, but to reorient it, to save modernity from itself again, we might say. Perestroika, or restructuring, was the great name of the policy he implemented. In the language of our course, what is perestroika all about? It's about improving a new vision of development. And perestroika is how we develop better. But there was another component to his policy. It's glasnost, or openness. And in our course, democracy, right? I mean, these are the two elements that Gorbachev preaches, but you can see how, or I've tried to set up this course for you in a way that you can see how our big concepts are resonating. Practically every thinker and every philosophical figure, every cultural force, every president is in some ways dealing with this problem and this tension, because it is the fundamental question, the fundamental problem of modernity. Gorbachev was maybe the first, no, not maybe, definitely the first leader of the Soviet Union to be born from a younger generation. An interesting thing to note about the last Soviet leaders, or all the Soviet leaders, besides the fact they're intimately bald and not bald. Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, Brezhnev, and back and forth. But is that they were all really members of that first founding generation. And one reason that the last presidencies or the last leaders reign or rule for such a short period of time is because that they are not being plucked from a younger generation. After Brezhnev, Chernenko, and Andropov, they're members still of Khrushchev's and Brezhnev's generation. Gorbachev is the first leader to be plucked from a younger class, somebody who was born in 1931. He was only a child during the Soviet terror, not somebody who had participated as a party member in that time or been. And so he has a kind of different generational view of life, and I think expressed very well in some of his speeches around the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union about Russia's relationship to Europe and the connection between the two. I might just linger for a moment as we think about Russia's connection to Europe on this statement here. For centuries, Europe has been making an indispensable contribution to world politics, economy, and culture, and to the development of the entire civilization. Its world historical role is recognized and respected everywhere. Let us not forget, however, that the metastases of colonial slavery spread around the world from Europe. It was here that fascism came into being. It was here that the most destructive war started. If I had to pick one quote, this would be a candidate maybe for it, for what expresses best this way in which Russia becomes a mirror to Europe, a distorting mirror, but an important mirror nonetheless, that helps Europe see its place in the world. This quotation is a wonderful example of that. Russia as a way of looking at Europe, Dostoevsky says things that are very similar, acknowledges the culture, the contribution to development, economy, all these things we associate with the vision of European modernity, says they are good and great, and that we in Russia want this as well. And at the same time says, but let's not forget that fascism is a European phenomenon, not an anti-European phenomenon. Let us not forget that colonial slavery of the French and the English is also a European phenomenon that inspired Hitler to a great degree. Russia remains, throughout this period, and here we see again a wonderful kind of mirror for the European aspiration to build a new world order, and Russia's simultaneous fascination with that aspiration, and also skepticism about it. Now, to move concretely to the question of a return to the past, to orthodoxy in the literal sense of the Orthodox Church, let us just take a look at one of the most famous churches in Moscow, Moscow's Christ the Savior Cathedral. It's been the subject of a number of monographs too. But to tell its story in 3 lines, here you see it in a picture from 1911 between 1905 and 1911, I believe, that it was built, and we can tell the whole story of the course through this one monument in many ways, by Alexander I to give thanks to God for his defeat of Napoleon in the War of 1812. To go back to maybe the second lecture of the course. Alexander I, the moment when Russian nationalism begins, is really Tsar Alexander I's defeat of Napoleon during the invasion of Moscow, the invasion of Russia. And this church was built to commemorate that. It was built over the course of the next several decades. It wasn't completed till the reign of Nicholas I, right before the Crimean War, around the time of the revolutions of 1848. In 1935, it was famously, significantly torn down by Joseph Stalin, kind of a symbol of the atheism the Soviet Union was supposed to bring to the world. It was turned into the largest outdoor swimming pool in the entire world, serving, you can say, the people in a much more practical, everyday way. But under Yeltsin, and then this was one of Yeltsin's projects that was continued by Putin from 1995 to 2000, it was rebuilt to look almost identical to what it looked like before. A return to orthodoxy, a return to Russia's former vision of itself. Only now the marble and the granite were replaced by concrete, in some cases plastic. It wasn't perhaps quite as authentic, or it wasn't quite a reproduction in the old materials of what had been before. And it became the site maybe of one of the most famous or infamous, depending on your views, questionings of Putin and the March 3rd, 2012 performance by the feminist punk group Pussy Riot. All takes place inside this newly rebuilt cathedral, led by Nadezhda Tolonikova and Maria Aryokina. But what is...
Святой ведет протестующих снова конвой, дабы святейшего не оскорбить. Женщина может рожать и любить.
That goes on in that key for a while more, but I mean, another reason why I think Russia makes a wonderful mirror for Europe, quite apart from Russia's interest in and of itself, is the way in which we see many of the extremes that are expressed in Europe in a far more radical form in Russia. A deeper, more profound commitment to God on the one hand, and a deeper and more profound, you could say, renunciation of God. Soviet atheism, the entire rejection of God, is much stronger than any kind of secularism that happens in France or in other parts of Europe. At the same time, you could say, and that kind of those extremes, the radicalism of belief, whether it is conservative or it is left wing, is one way in which we see how Russia carries to their logical extreme ideas that are born and first tried out in Europe. Feminism in a, what is this, what we would say, in a, I don't know what kind of key even. Now, the question of Russia's return to its Orthodox past, to its Orthodox origins, is not something we can resolve, but it's one I hope that the question about is resonating with you now, too. When we think about what it would mean to go back to a more authentic version of Russia. But it does make its way into all kinds of expressions of popular culture, high culture too. One place to see the Russian church, or the Orthodox church, is in the marvelous film Leviathan, which was nominated for an Academy Award, along with Tangerines a few years ago when there were many Eastern European films sort of on the market. But again, I would like to play you the trailer here, just so you can see and so you can think about the way in which the themes of this course are fusing in this film here, just to give you a sense of what to look for. The idea of legal rights. Who has legal rights? Where is God? Bureaucracy. How bureaucracy is an attempt to rationalize the world, to make it work more effectively, and often ends up tripping over itself. Question of justice that we've been talking about today. The Leviathan as Thomas Hobbes' original vision of the state that is supposed to be the modern state. And finally, the great question that we've been asking throughout the 19th century, at least ever since Nietzsche declared the death of God in 1882. Where is this God? Or since Job posed the question in the Bible.
Вы сейчас здесь не имеете права здесь находиться. Решение суда еще в силу не вступило.
У тебя никогда никаких прав не было! Нет и не будет!
Ну понятно же, что сука для себя местечко освобождает.
Всякая власть от Бога. Пока Богу угодно, беспокоиться тебе. А вот угодно ему.
Я же вам объясняю, прокурора нет на месте, а я не уполномочена.
На тебе, полистайте.
Ну, а если я не буду читать вот это, тогда что?
Я-то думал, что в этом городе для тебя ничего невозможного нет. Я хочу, чтобы Николай остался при своем.
Люблю тебя.
Меня отстрелялись, у меня мишени поинтереснее.
А из нынешних кого нет?
Мало исторического зазора.
Где твой Бог милосердный?
На земле нет подобного ему.
The same questions, the same themes continue to resonate. That resonated already, you could say, in the middle of the 19th century. They haven't gone anywhere. perhaps people have become somewhat more cynical and more skeptical about our possibility about bringing them to life. What the New World Order promised and created to some extent by the revolutions, French revolutions, especially the pan-European revolutions of 1848, still in many ways sets the agenda for our lives and our experiences today. And in Russia, I would argue, it is no different. The strong promise or vision of the Soviet Union is gone. And I think people make a mistake when they try to see European and Russian relations in terms of a new Cold War. They miss what's new about the situation today. But I think we can see in Russia lots of the same problems that are afflicting Europe and the rest of the world in its grappling with modernity and the crisis of modernity. The lack of a strong vision. You could say, what is Putin's vision? It's not a strong vision in the way that the Soviet vision was a strong vision. What is the American vision now? Trump really doesn't have a vision. And Biden, he has trying to restore something that was. Perhaps the crisis of modernity has to do with the lack of these large visions and the large narratives and stories that we can tell through those visions. We have voices within Russia, too, of course, questioning. Alexei Navalny has described a self-described nationalist Democrat and a critic of Putin's corruption, precisely what you could say on display in the movie, and the founder of the People's Movement. But I want to turn in the third part of this lecture now to asking what Putin's Russia really is all about, what it represents, what it symbolizes. In the second part of this lecture, I raised the question for you about whether Russia has returned since the collapse of the Soviet Union to orthodoxy, and what that return to orthodoxy might mean. And I've suggested that in some ways it has. And in many ways, I think Putin has been part of his agenda, or his aim is to return to something that was lost. And in that sense, he's no different from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, or any of the other peripheral countries. They're all trying to return to something that was lost when the breakup of the Soviet Union happened. The only difference is that their vision and their version of what was lost was quite different. What they wanted to go back to was a different kind of national memory. In emphasizing this to you now, I hope you can see how the point I made to you when we introduced part 3 of the course, how relevant it is. That the post-World War II world is a world that keeps on looking backward. It keeps on looking back much more than the pre-World War II world did. In the era of sort of optimistic modernity, from 1848 to 1948, you might even say, to pick a 100-year period and look up until the Third Man and the film and the Vienna Ferris wheel. The vision was a forward-looking one, a one that said, our tomorrow will be better than our yesterday, and our aim is to create a world that is better for our children. But since the Second World War, and since, in many ways, the difficulties of implementing that vision have become more powerful and more important, hence the industry that studies the politics of memory. Hence we have all of these museum culture that is much more significantly funded and more widespread than ever before. Hence we have conservative parties that have a position and power that they unprecedented, you could say, in comparison to their power in the past. So that's the larger European, maybe global context even, for Putinism. And I want to look at, in a moment, Eurasianism. So what is the Kremlin's agenda? Well, it's a combination of factors, you could say, like for any countries, in economics, maybe geopolitical somewhat, ideological. It's harder to talk about it, perhaps, than it was to talk about the Soviet Union, because the vision is not based on any single or great one ideology. The figures who have become important, at least briefly, in Putin's government were figures like Sergei Naryshkin, right, the chairman of the State Duma. And I put him up here just because he was important as the head of the Historical Truth Commission, another example of backward-lookingness under the Putin regime, charged with the task, or his task was to investigate and to correct falsifications of the historical narrative about World War II. Everywhere where Russia's narrative was not represented as heroic in the Second World War, saving the world from fascism, this sort of institute investigated. There were figures like Sergei Shoigu, I point him out too because he's another example of this kind of friendship, or the Soviet nationalities policy, and the Soviet person of Tuvash and Russian parents, Minister of Defense, Ministry of Emergency Situations. But most significantly, Vladislav Surkov, born to Chechen and Russian parents, deputy prime minister, the personal advisor to Putin on the Caucasus, Abkhazia, and Ukraine, and perhaps for a while seen as the most important voice in the Kremlin, the most important influence on policy. One of the readings for this week I've asked you to look at is Surkov's statement about what Russia does and what it means to the world. And I quote from that, Putin's Lasting State, just last year, translated into English, where he talks about, again, in this way, Surkov provides a wonderful distorted mirror, perhaps, to Europe, a way of looking at Europe that makes us question the things we value about Europe and ask whether they're in fact whether he might have a point, whether the things we want can be achieved. He puts this under and the thing that he talks about specifically here is the illusion of choice. The Western world, the European world, the modern world, so far as it is European, has always been based upon the illusion of choice. And that is the main trick of Western democracy. The rejection of this illusion is in favor of realism, he writes, of predestination, has led our society reflect upon its own sovereign version of democratic development. Notice that in this essay, if you do a discourse analysis, he doesn't throw out the word democracy. The word democracy is still very much there, but he advocates for a different application of it. The Russian state, he says, starts with trust and relies on trust. This is the main distinction from the Western model, which cultivates mistrust and criticism, and this is the source of its power. One can debate, of course, any of these particular claims and the use of any of these terms. But it's helpful to see how Russia, under Putin, has continued to represent itself as it has been all along, ever since Chadaev's first philosophical letter, ever since Kirevsky's response, as a kind of society and a kind of state that is oriented first and foremost to the West and to Europe. That is either rejecting it or embracing it, continuing some aspects, taking the same words and using them in a different way. What was the Soviet experiment, if not the practice of this principle with Marxism, a German Jewish thinker writing in London? But we see the continuation, perhaps, of this larger tendency or trend in the relationship between Russia and Europe, I think, in reading Surkov closely. Now, how did Putin happen? How did Putinism happen? How did this return to orthodoxy acquire the kind of power that it acquired in the 2000s? And I don't think we can explain Putin's importance and power without looking back to Boris Yeltsin and the 1990s and what happened when Russia attempted to follow the American model. And Boris Yeltsin and the oligarchs have entitled a slide, Russian president 1991 to 1999. But the key, you could say, question where Russia suffered by following American advice was in its attempt to apply American models of capitalism and development. The 1995 loans for share programs meant the auctioning off of state assets. Yeltsin spoke about this in very optimistic terms, again using our language. Russian bankers take part in the country's political life. The banks, like all of Russia, are learning democracy, he said. Well, they were learning how to, democracy perhaps, but they were learning how to embezzle. They were learning how to create a small elite that dominates the majority. And if that had been, in some sense, the problem of the Soviet Union, what was done in the name of the people was not in fact done in the name of the people, all of a sudden seemed like American capitalism wasn't much better. It was simply taking those same, you could say, Russian communist officials were rebranding themselves capitalists and appropriating the same wealth. There wasn't a very significant change in the way in which the vast majority of society benefited from these new political developments. Under Yeltsin, we saw the making of a super rich, super wealthy class of the oligarchs. Three of the most famous, Boris Berezovsky, founder of or president of Gazprom, actually, he's an interesting figure. He's the oldest of the ones we're looking at. A former intellectual who had been writing papers. The younger ones were not nearly so intellectual. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, president or head of Yukos. Again, natural gas and oil companies are at the center of all of these billionaires' billions. Or Roman Abramovich, and back to Gazprom, and the owners of several football or soccer teams in Britain. But part of Yeltsin's legacy was the application of a free market principle in order to create a couple or a few super rich oligarchs. It was not the creation of a more democratic society, it seemed. Or perhaps it wasn't even the creation of a more developed society. It was in no way the fulfillment of the principle or the promise of modernity. And I think this is the important background to the rise of Vladimir Putin's united Russia and his concepts that have resonated, like the vertical of power, and his use of other people, in promoting kind of his own vision. Born in 1952 in Leningrad, he made his career in the KGB in East Germany, reaching the status or the rank of colonel. And his German is, in fact, excellent and good. When I first moved to Germany and was sort of learning German, it was around the time he made his speech to the I don't remember the Reichstag or the Bundestag, but he made it entirely in German, and it was received, and I was sort of fascinated by his command of the language, and I was only just starting to learn at that point. And he earned a lot of of praise for his command of the language, maybe not so much for his policies. But it wasn't clear at that point yet. This was around 2000, 2001, exactly what kind of president he would be, what he would symbolize. In 1996, he came to Moscow at Yeltsin's invitation, really to help with clearing up the messes that had been emerged over the course of the 1990s. And in the 2000 presidential election, he took 52% of the vote, a decisive majority, but not an overwhelming one. And from that time forth, you could say he has only consolidated or strengthened his position as the leader. I mean, there have been various challenges to his power. We looked at cultural challenges like the Pussy Riots, and there have been more significant political challenges as well. But throughout the last 20 years, I mean, really the two longest serving European or politicians, if we include Russia and Europe here, are Putin and Angela Merkel. In many ways, interesting that they are in some ways mirror images of one another. Not that they get along at all, they don't, but Merkel also speaks Russian, and Putin speaks German, and they are long-serving members of alliances that might have crumbled under a lot of other control. So what is Putin's power vertical, the notion of the vertical velocity? Or that it begins, as I suggested earlier, really with his response to Chechen terrorism. The 1999 apartment bombings, in 2004 there were the Moscow metro bombings. There are all kinds of conspiratorial films and videos you could watch about this, asking whether Putin planned them himself, a little bit the same way people conspiratorially speculate about 9/11 in the United States, whether the Trade Center towers were this was actually an inside job on some level. And I don't want to take a stand on these issues, because what's interesting for our purposes here is not whether Putin is responsible or not, but how they enable him to consolidate his power. We might remember, too, from our earlier lectures, how important a foreign or an enemy is to the consolidation of power. How George Bush, but also Hitler and Stalin, all managed to declare emergency situations by pointing to an enemy who was attacking the state. And in many ways, that's what Putin does early in his rule. It's often said that one of his impacts is to this vertical of power, of course, is to consolidate power. The fear that we've seen all throughout our course, that when people have, and everybody has a voice to speak for themselves, we get a cacophony. You don't get Bakhtinian polyphony. You get cacophony, a lot of different voices saying a lot of different things which can never be reconciled. And in moments of despair, people yearn for a single leader who can consolidate them. In many ways, that's what Putin has offered. Under Putin's reign, 89 regional leaders who were previously elected are now appointed. That's one way of consolidating the vertical of power, of turning elections, democratic elections, into questions of appointments. From 2005 to 2012, a youth movement, the Nashi movement, or ours, emerged in Russia to consolidate a kind of a Putin youth, you could say, anti-fascist in its inspiration and in its direction, and people made comparisons to other times and other places. But Putin's great accomplishment, I think, is to give Russians a vision to believe in, not as a strong vision as the Soviet Union was, but a vision of national pride, a vision of functioning bureaucracy and structure, and a vision of a leader who is willing to stand up, you could say, to the West and to Europe in a way that Yeltsin didn't seem like he was prepared to do. Another one of the assigned readings for this week comes from, and I mentioned this in my letter to you, my posting to you just shortly before class, is in this analysis of the Russian media coming from within Russia. The authors of this piece actually visited Tartu a few years ago, and they've written a lot since then too. But I invite you to look at this for its way in which it gives us a new, or a different, you could say, point of view on how Russia relates to Europe. So Gayropa is the term they coin in this article of the image of Europe propagated in Russian journalism. So what's the basis of their study? Well, read the article. But what they're doing is looking at all the Russian journals, from Ogonyok to Literatura Gazeta. I mean, there are many other journals too, Kommersant, I think, that they're analyzing for how the language, how Russia is being talked about. You might notice that they're doing something that Barthes was kind of doing in the 1950s when he was analyzing the discourse of France. But they are taking very similar sources and trying to look at its language to understand what is this relationship between Russia and Europe. And what they come up with is this interesting term, Gayropa, noting that in national polls, only 13% of Russians back in 2014, I'm sure that hasn't gone up very much since then, identify with Europe. And reminding us that really Dostoevsky perhaps was one of the first writers to give us this vision of two Europes that they are capitalizing on. So what are those two Europes? Europe and Gayropa here, as the map suggests. See, Estonia is even part of the true Europe, according to this map. The old Europe, morally clear, robust, masculine, self-confident, stands for clear conservative values and gender roles. The new Europe, or Gayropa, is postmodern and depraved, gay and effeminate, experiencing decline and identity crisis. They don't subscribe to these ideas, and I'm not subscribing to any of these ideas, but they're just trying to understand how these labels are being fixed to different practices and different elements of European society, and how Russia is, again, providing a kind of distorted mirror to Europe, looking at some visions or versions of Europe, the Orthodox, old, morally clear, robust, masculine, self-confident, and saying this is the good Europe. This is an old tradition. If you think about how the Orthodox Church itself was founded as a way to save the Church from itself. Now, Russia is presenting itself as a way to save Europe from itself. And what is it saving it from? From that postmodern turn that we talked about in our last week, from the turn in the 1960s towards radical relativism, towards questioning everything, towards a lack of clear identity. If postmodernism represents anything at all in a wider cultural sense, it's skepticism about all identities. At one time, noticing and maybe even celebrating a multiplicity of identities, but at the same time, fearing and questioning anybody who claims too strong identity, too strong and clear and limited. And one question I'd ask you to ask yourselves, I'm not going to answer it for you, but as you read this article and do a close reading of it, is how do Muslims in Europe fit into the discourse of the old and new Europe, according to Ryabov and Ryabova, the authors of this article on Gayropa? Are they part of the new Europe? Are they part of the old Europe? Do Muslims represent something traditional, or do they represent something new? The question of where Muslims today fit into Europe is a fascinating one for what it reveals about, you can say, the identity crisis that Europe is undergoing. Of course, it says much more about Europeans than it does about Muslims. One voice, and I've assigned actually even two pieces by him because I think he's an important symptom of the times, not necessarily because he's an important authority, but is the kind of somewhat, some would say crazy, but let's just say sort of radical kind of thinker, Alexander Dugin, who has turned Eurasianism or Neo-Eurasianism into the new philosophy of Russia. He claims this to be this, a post-Soviet identity and worldview for Putin's Russia. The story of Dugin's sort of rise to prominence and to celebrity, at least in the Western media and to some extent within Russia, goes back a long way. Already in the 90s, he was trying to use experimenting with new forms of political allegiance and political identity. In 1993, he helped found the National Bolshevik Party with this kind of flag, which kind of reminds you of a few different flags we've seen in the past. And it was in 2002 that he founds the Eurasianist Party. And this is one reason why I include him here, is because he is important as a figure who helps to generate a wider mass movement. He might not influence Putin that much, but he inspires a lot of people on the ground. And the idea of creating a political party devoted to Eurasianism is largely sort of his production or creation. He also is rather prominent academically for a while. He's the chair of sociology at the Department of Moscow State University, no longer now. And through his multiple writings, like the Foundations of Geopolitics in 1997, or the Fourth Political Theory in 2009, he gives voice to the crisis of modernity, perhaps in a more extensive way than perhaps any other writer we've looked at in Russia. Talking about the crisis in a geopolitical sense on the one hand, but also in an ideological and moral sense. The problems of development and the problems of democracy are both present in his writings, perhaps more clearly than they are in some of the more influential and important writers. I'm just going to give you a moment, a chance to speak in his own voice, in English. Can you imagine Western intellectuals going to Russia and speaking in Russian? No. But against sort of an image of Nicholas II, right? The Orthodox, who was canonized actually while I was in Russia last, about more than 13 years ago, or 12 years ago, I think, and became, a national saint. But listen to what he has to say about the West and the East, Orthodoxy and Europe, and we'll just listen to a couple minutes here in this interview with the British press. Ooh.
Well, everything is relative, and we in Russia, we could use postmodernity in order to explain to the West that if any truth is relative, so we have our special Russian truth that you need to accept as something that maybe is not your truth.
Even if it's not true.
But if the truth is relative, that doesn't mean that the truth doesn't exist. That means that absolute truth, one for all, doesn't exist.
Let's take an example. If you watch Russian television today, you'd think that Russia and America were about to go to war.
Yes, but the same if we are examining, if we are reading American press, we have the same impression.
Not really. I've just come back from America. You don't really get that impression. Do you think this is genuinely the case?
No, I think that now the situation is in Syria, for example, United States continuing to be unipolar or continuing to consider itself as unipolar power, it says no more Assad. And Atlanticist powers of the Western Europe repeats after Washington. We doesn't want any more Assad, but Putin, other civilization says stop. Let have Assad, and after that there is our nuclear and military power behind us. So, and that is serious. If you are boss, you could not let the other decide, if you really is a boss, decide what to do in your realm of responsibility. It is conflict.
I see. One way in which Dugin is important is kind of as a cheerleader for sort of Putin's policies, whatever they happen to be. Again, not to overemphasize his influence, but if you notice too, at the very beginning, he puts together two things that I think are really at the root or crucial to this lecture, which I want you to sort of bear in mind. He talks about Russia as having a special truth, its own perspective on things, how we have to return to our own civilization, a civilization based on Orthodox religious conservatism. But he says at the very first statements here, we can use postmodern relativism to do this. That postmodernity can serve kind of Russian interests. Another very interesting case in which the relationship between Russia and Europe is not mirrors, but how borrowing elements, moving back and forth. In Dugin, we have this the ultimate combination, maybe, of the two visions, a methodology that comes from the West, as he describes it himself, and a set of values that comes from the East, or from Russia itself. How postmodern relativism, the whole point of this dialogue is to show how postmodern relativism can serve the interests of Orthodox religious conservatism in Russia. How if we accept a world that is multipolar, that doesn't have a single source of authority, we have to accept that there are civilizations, that there are cultures that have a different way of doing things. Don't subscribe to the universal standards prescribed elsewhere. Now, this is all important too because in 2014, a Eurasian Economic Union did in fact come into being. And in some ways it can be imagined or thought of, at least for the purposes of our course, as a potential competitor to the European Union. Current members are Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, of course, was the president there, Belarus, Russia, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan. It was proposed in 1994 by Nazarbayev himself at Moscow State University, and it integrates some 183 million people and proposes a kind of economic integration of a part of the world that Alexander Dugin, at least, describes as a coherent civilization. A part of the world that has Muslims and Orthodox Christians, and it has Buddhists, members of all kinds of religions, in many ways recreates the Soviet Union, but in a Eurasianist key, precisely what Nikolai Trubetskoy was calling for or trying to imagine back in the 1920s. I've also asked for you to look at and read one of Putin's own speeches. And in many ways, you could look at the readings this week along the vertical of power. I mean, you can imagine that there's some from the top and some from the bottom. And I do hope I get to just show you the last article here, in addition to all of these. But the Valdai International Discussion Club, I think, is a fascinating institution, phenomenon, kind of unique to Russia, and which expresses in its form, as much as its content, Russia's role and place in the world today. It was founded in 2004 to be a place for free thinkers from all around the world to get together to discuss great ideas. Many people have gone to participate, from China, from Norway, Nobel laureates, and quite provocatively it claims that there's a greater freedom for thought and discussion here than at the institutions of the West, where everything is controlled by capitalism or controlled by the interests of NATO or by the interests of particular. What Russia has done, or what Putin has done for Russia by creating the Valdai International Discussion Club, is what Russia has been doing all throughout its history, is providing Europe with an alternative universalism, an alternative place to ask the big questions of modern civilization. On October 24th, 2014, in Sochi City, Putin took up the challenge, and as he does in pretty much every Valdai Discussion Club meeting, once a year it happens, by asking the big questions. In this case, the world order. Are we living in a world with new rules, or is the new world order a game without rules? How to understand it? The link I've given you is to his actual speech. You can watch him give it. But you can find text of the speech, too, if you just want to read it. And I just quote this one line from it. The Cold War ended, but it did not end with the signing of a peace treaty with clear and transparent agreements on respecting existing rules or creating new rules and standards. This created the impression that the so-called victors in the Cold War had decided to pressure events and reshape the world to suit their own needs and interests. When I say that Russia represents not simply Russian particularism, but a new universalism, an alternative universalism to Europe's universalism or America's universalism. It can be found in this statement right here. In trying to call the West on its hypocrisy, showing in many ways what happened in 1991 was very similar to the way in which World War II ended, when we had the Nuremberg trials, and only some people were put on trial, and only some people were brought to justice, but all in the name of the greater interest of the whole. This might be cynical. Putin might, but on some level, it's true. It's true that the Cold War ended. It did not end with the signing of a peace treaty. Nobody can dispute that. It did not end with a clear and transparent agreements on respecting existing rules or creating new rules and standards. And it did create, in some sense, the impression of a victor's justice. And it has left open the question whether the new world order, the world order adopted under Yeltsin, right, in Russia, was really first and foremost an American-led world order, serving American interests and American needs, not the interests of the globe as a whole. Every year, Putin gives a speech that's a little bit on this level. In 2017, it was creative destruction. Will a new world order emerge from the current conflicts? He rehashes some of the same ideas. But the Valdai International Discussion Club as a vision and as an institution is a fascinating phenomenon, a place to debate the big questions outside of, as he would say, American and maybe European hegemony. We won't have time to do this section at all, but I want to just mention it. In many ways, Ukraine's Euromaidan and the attempt to ally, you can say, or create with Europe in the demonstrations that erupted just a few years ago, or now it's a little bit longer ago, but on Kiev's Independence Square, maybe speaks to the most profound and prominent place where the crisis of modernity is unfolding in our times. In many ways, Ukraine, a name that even means sort of being on the border. And the crisis of the Ukrainian subject, you could say, is where we find maybe the crisis of modernity in its most prominent and powerful form. I am constantly reminding you and talking to you about how Estonia and Tartu is also on the border. It is. But for this purpose, I think Ukraine is much easier to be more prominent, sort of borderland example. It should be remembered that Ukraine's Euromaidan and the question about whether Ukraine really belongs in Europe or it belongs in alliance with Russia was the culmination or the outcome of several different revolutions and since the collapse of communism about Ukraine's identity, going back to the Revolution on Granite of 1990, the Ukraine without Kuchma of 2001, the Orange Revolution, and always taking on the larger questions of development and democracy, of whether corruption can be rooted out, and whether a moral global interest can be found in Ukrainian life and development. Now, the outcome of this, of course, one of the immediate outcomes was in March 2014, Russia's re-annexation of Crimea, and in August 2014, the war in Donbass, and sort of the fight with the Russian separatists or with the separatists in that part of Ukraine. There's a documentary, very, you can say, pro-Ukrainian one on Netflix, Winter on Fire, which is fascinating for all the details it provides. I actually prefer it to some of the more even-handed documentaries because it's just done better in terms of production value. And it also gives you a better sense, I think, of what the people who are for the alliance with Europe are fighting for. I have yet to see as good a film or a take on the other side. We'll skip all of the particulars of this, but I want to get just to one point I wanted to make here was simply that the politics of memory is more prominent here than anywhere else. There are no more, you could say, places where there are people who can be declared or proclaimed both heroes and villains. In 2010, President of Ukraine Viktor Yushchenko proclaimed Stepan Bandera a hero of Ukraine, which was condemned by the EU Parliament, by Russia, by Poland, and by Jewish organizations. So the question, maybe the most prominent question of how to deal with the past and how it relates to the present is really in Ukraine and with this figure here. Is he a national hero or a Nazi collaborator? The organization of Ukrainian nationalists that he led is sort of celebrated. You can see his face on carried as an icon there in protests. But the larger question of how we should remember this one person, what he symbolizes, what he represents, something good or something bad, or is one of the most painful questions you can say that, that this part of the world is facing today. But this is the last slide I wanted to end with, and it's because it's the most modest figure that we're looking at in the readings today, perhaps in the readings in the whole entire course, and in many ways it's a great place to conclude our thinking about Russia. Dorji Batomkunyov was a 20-year-old volunteer born in Ulan-Ude, the Buryat Republic of the Russian Federation, and this was his path from his birthplace to Donetsk to go fight for the separatists. He became a tank gunner there, a common soldier at the age of 20. And the question that I posed to you in the email today and that I want to leave you with in the lecture today is, why would a Buryat Buddhist want to participate in this fight for the separatists and for Putin? In some, what is he fighting for? It's a question to us all. It's probably younger even than you are. To fight or not to fight? That is always the ultimate question about how we participate in the political struggles of the world we're in. To what extent are we willing to sacrifice ourselves and our well-being for a greater or a better world order? He becomes horribly injured, in this fight. And I warn you, if you haven't looked at the article yet, there are pictures of his wounds. But I want to leave you with this quote from him. Quote comes from, say, a common soldier in this conflict. You have to respect the people's choice. If Donetsk wants independence, you got to give it. I talked with the nurses and the doctors here. They told me, we wish we had independence, a government like yours, and Putin. Themes of democracy, themes of justice, themes of geopolitical self-defense, they resonate in his writings or in his interview. But read this closely and think about what's the difference and what's the similarity between the people at the top and the people at the bottom. Are they speaking about the same themes in different ways? Are they speaking about different themes? How can we bring them together, at least in our imagination, to envision the kind of Russia, the kind of world we would like to live in more broadly? We'll continue with these themes next week when we turn to the European side of things, but I think this is a good place to end for today.